Well, to gauge the reaction from India's business community, I'm joined by Mr. Adi Godrej from the Godrej Group, Mr. Chandrajit Banerjee, the Director General of the CII, and Mr. Russell Pereira from KPMG. Well, first of all, if I can ask you, what do you make of the budget?
I think there were some good parts of the budget. There were some not so good parts. I think the best part of the budget was an announcement that they wish to keep subsidies within 2% of the GDP. I think this is the first time in India that a government has announced that they wish to put a cap on subsidies as a percentage of GDP. I think this is a good move, and I do hope that they are able to execute on that.
Sticking on the topic of subsidies for a minute, do you think, Mr. Banerjee, that the finance minister did enough on subsidies?
I think what was important is to make a signal and to make a beginning of rationalization and also directing the subsidies. And I think he's made a very clear point that he is going to do that, and there is going to be a clear roadmap towards that over a period of time. And I would give the finance minister full marks in terms of starting it off. A lot more to be done given the type of fiscal tightness that we have, and therefore we would have really wanted to see things like dual pricing of the diesel and things like that in the subsidy ambit. But I would think that yes, it's a good beginning.
I think just building on what everyone said, clearly he pressed all the right buttons. He talked about the fact that he needed to reduce the fiscal deficit, he needed to cut subsidies, he needed to kind of increase the revenues and how he was going to get that, the supply side bottlenecks on that. What kind of a couple of points that left me a little bit concerned was he started about last year at 4.6 on the fiscal, he ended up at 5.9. He's talking about 5.1 right now, and many would say that he being more realistic. But that's predicated on actually capping subsidies at 2. Okay? If you look at over the last year, as a result of maybe the movement in oil and other things, the subsidy bill went quite a lot more than budgeted. So how that plays out and how that knocks on to inflation, I think, is something that we'll have to see.
Also, the much talked about policy paralysis. Do you think he did enough to break that? And has the sentiment among India's industry actually improved?
No, he could have done more, but he is working under some political constraints. So I think he was being a little cautious. But policy paralysis can be overcome after a month, after 2 months. So there's no particular need for him to have been very articulate about that in the budget speech. I do hope they go in that direction very soon. They sort out some of the political problems. The political situation has changed after the state elections recently, so they could bring in more allies into the UPA. And once they're reasonably sure of adequate support, I think then they will go about it. And I do hope they go about it.
But overall, the politics seems to be overshadowing the economics. And is that a concern for you?
The way I look at it is, while I don't see any big bang approach into the budget, which is from what you said is he had a tightrope walking to do. But I think it's a very realistic budget. He's talked about, even on the taxation front, if you see, the widening of the tax net is something that we have been talking about for quite some time now, and he's taken that step. In the absence of GST, when we are seeing that GST, which would add definitely about 1 to 1.5% to our growth rate, when he's not been able to do that, he has actually indicated GST1. He's talked about clubbing of the two forms into one. So I think he has shown a considerable desire, and he's shown it in the budget that yes, he would move on the path of reforms. Much of it will be outside the budget.
But also, we didn't hear anything more about foreign direct investment in multi-brand retail. Is that something that you missed?
We must remember that the budget is not necessarily the platform on which all policy decisions, all reforms need to be announced. Sometimes some reforms don't need parliamentary approval, and it's much better to do it when Parliament is not in session. I think last time they made a mistake announcing multi-brand retail opening up when Parliament was in session. If they could have easily done it, it didn't need parliamentary approval. So I think one has to be a little more tactical on how you go about some of these.
Mr. Banerjee, if I can ask you, what do you think were the missed opportunities?
Fiscal consolidation was something which is everybody is talking about, because that's something which we really need to see to kick in growth. And the second area I would think is how we could really bring in, could have brought in a larger push into investments. Here we see, of course, excise getting up from 10 to 12%, which is itself a bit of a dampener, but which was something that we were expecting it, because this came during the last economic sort of a crisis that one had gone through. The idea is to how you get things done, like the GST moving, FDI in retail moving, and all of this need not necessarily have to find place in the budget.
To sum up, the business community did say that they had low expectations from the budget. So, if I can ask you briefly, what do you make of it? Do you think it's a bold budget? Do you think he delivered? Or do you think it was below expectations?
I wouldn't call it below expectations. I think under the circumstances it was not a bad budget. I think the circumstances were very difficult. I think some of the things could have been done differently. But there's some good steps been taken.
I would think that it was a very realistic budget. Given the type of times that we are living in, this was I think a good budget, realistic budget, and not a big bang approach, yet really touching upon some of the most important and crucial sectors which can deliver what we are looking forward to, that is growth and triggering of investments.
You can only play with the cards dealt to you. And I think with the backdrop of the political and economic scenario, I think he has dealt out a reasonable hand. I think it's been an astute, fine balance. Certainly, of course, there are things that we'd all like to him to have done more, and there may be things that he could have done more. But I think it's reasonable, I think, on that. And I think what happens actually after the budget, as the dust settles down on that, and the policy aspects that we spoke about, which one would not normally expect in the budget but expect to happen later on, could have a much bigger impact, I think, than actually the budget right now.
That was Adi Godrej, Russell Pereira and Chandrajit Banerjee joining me there. Well, it's time for a short break now, but don't go away, because when we come back...
From Mumbai, we'll be gauging who are the winners and losers amongst the Indian public.